presentation on the 5 audit and GRC trends that should be on your radar in 2019. ERP Maestro is very proud to join forces with Xiting, and we're presenting this together today because we're both companies that operate in the GRC and security space. And we interact with thousands of clients around the world, so we get to see these new trends up and personal. And our intent here today is to summarize much of it for you. Now there's a ton of contents there, so I'm gonna jump right in. So firstly, some short introductions. I'm the CEO and founder of ERP Maestro, and we're a suite of controls for securing access in SAP. And the focus is really on the automation of access controls. You know, those tough controls to get right, which are segregation of duties, emergency access, automated provisioning, deprovisioning, etc. Well, that's what we automate. And we serve many of the Fortune 500, and we do this through a simple cloud-based delivery model. My background brings me from KPMG, where I was a director in charge of the GRC service line. The value that I want to bring to you today is going to be on talking about the trends around GDPR, cybersecurity, and the automation of controls. And with me today, I have Michael Kummer from Xiting. Mike, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jody. Hey, my name is Michael. I'm the Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Xiting, and we are a solution provider focusing on automating and simplifying SAP security, and specifically around roles and authorizations, role testing, migrations to S/4HANA, and many other things. So thanks, Jody and team, for having me on this webinar today.
Absolutely, thank you. So what are the 5 major trends in 2019? This is really not an exhaustive list, but it's what's spoken about the most often. And we are going to be diving into each in a bit more detail through this session. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard about the impact of GDPR, which was rolled out in May of 2018, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it gives EU citizens more control over their personal data. Now, for those in the EU, this has obvious implications, but for those outside, it has implications as well. Now, most companies do business in Europe, so needless to say, this has had a lot of companies scrambling to adapt privacy controls. And even just to understand its implications on the way that we all do business has been a bit challenging. So this regulation has and still will in 2019 have global implications. Cybersecurity continues to have an implication on the way that we do business. Now, both from an external penetration of the IT environments themselves, but there's also now a higher focus on the protection of information from within the company's walls as well. And we see the trend of increased emphasis on a company's cybersecurity strategy just increasing in 2019. And GRC, while somewhat an old topic, but in the wake of increased regulation and cybersecurity threats, GRC is also receiving quite a bit more attention than it did before. Today's world has sophisticated financial systems, and they have complex security structures. And additionally, the cost of automation has decreased significantly. And with this comes a far higher expectation from shareholders and external auditors that companies implement strong automated controls around this. And that's where GRC comes in. We've even started seeing some legislation being discussed that would hold senior management of public companies personally liable for not implementing controls that prevent fraud. So, Mike, would you like to give a short intro on 4 and 5?
Yes, absolutely. So with number 4 in particular, we'll talk about the security implications of a trend that we've seen since SAP announced the end of life of the legacy ECC by 2025. So a lot of customers are currently either in the process, have already completed, or are planning the move to S4, and that has significant implications on your overall security, both from a GRC as well as role and authorization perspective. And so we'll take a closer look at what that means, and I'll give you some tips on what to consider if you're currently either in the process or thinking about moving to S4. And then we'll also take a look at how to decrease the vulnerability of your SAP system, specifically around RFC interfaces, those communications interfaces that you have between SAP and non-SAP systems, and what that means in light of those recent regulations like GDPR, and what you can do to properly reauthorize those interfaces and thus decrease your risk and potential liability.
Great. So it comes to our first topic, which is internal audit's role in GDPR compliance. I mentioned earlier, it was rolled out in May of 2018 and stands for Global Data Protection Regulation. And it gives the EU citizens more control over their personal data. And GDPR, it not only applies to those EU companies, but to all companies that sell to the market in which an EU citizen lives. Now, if non-compliance of GDPR is discovered, companies can face steep penalties and reputational damage, and even more so if an actual data breach occurs. Now, we've seen massive fines already, and it's a brand new piece of legislation, and reputational damage. Some examples have been Google and Facebook, and literally a day ago, Google was fined $57 million for not disclosing in their privacy policy the use of in accordance to the GDPR, the use of how they use private data across the world. And this is directly because of GDPR. The enforcement agencies are focusing on large companies first, of course, but they will start to move down the line and start to enforce this more and more through in 2019. Now, also because of GDPR, the global implications are starting to come to light as well. Here in the US, California is introducing its own Data Privacy Act, and it looks like it's going to come into effect in 2020. Sometime around June, the details will start to become a lot more clear. We'll continue to see more GDPR-like laws going into effect around the world as well. India is proposing their own, Brazil's own GDPR laws coming to effect in 2020 as well. So the entire world is moving to really enforce privacy a lot more. So you may ask yourself, what's the impact to you? What's the impact to me? Well, if you've not already, your company should already have started creating a privacy policy and other types of policies associated to GDPR that include provisions of this legislation, especially if you operate and your business has operations and sells to EU citizens, which many companies do. Now, we're already starting to see an increase in dedicated privacy officers as well, focused entirely on privacy for their company. You'll be surprised how challenging this sometimes is. Now, many times we are seeing internal audit at the front of this challenge, or at least sounding the alarm to the business for the lack of GDPR controls in place. And while larger companies have teams dedicated to this, smaller organizations will need help from consultants. And what we've seen and experienced ourselves, actually, it's almost everybody is learning right now. It's like those early days when SOC started and people are just throwing a whole bunch of smart people in a room with a problem and saying, hey, just please solve this. But the ones getting it right are the ones that are actually tackling it head on. And as others are solving it, their experience is creating some really great repeatable solutions that others can reuse. So if you've not taken this challenge on already, there are some good consultants with their lessons learned coming available on the market right now. Now, throughout this presentation, we are going to be conducting polls, and the reason for it is going to allow you to benchmark yourself to others that are attending this call. We will share the results. Please do complete them, because the more participation that we have, the higher value that the results will have for you. And it will also allow us to adjust as necessary while we go through this presentation. There we go. So the first one, does your company have a strategy in place for GDPR? This will be a great presentation for you to look at to see how you benchmark against the rest of the people attending. So we're seeing 18% as no, 41% as yes, 27% not sure, and 40% not applicable to the company. So that's great. 41% are working on the problem. That's excellent. The other 18 and 27, it would be if you are an internal audit or somewhere in the risk or on your leadership teams, it's probably something to look into. It's definitely a trend that will impact you in 2019. Okay, let's move on. Now, cybersecurity, and it just continues to receive a large amount of focus and attention, and this trend is not going to stop. 2019 is just going to get so much more. Now, most companies are increasing their spend in this area. If your security departments in your companies haven't actually increased this year, something's definitely not getting a lot of attention. Now, according to Accenture, in a 2017 survey, of all the companies surveyed that had some type of security event occur, they saw an average of 130 breaches per company on average. Now, the 2018 research is not out yet, but we already know that that's increased even more than what was predicted. So it's a really scary number. And you don't even know if you've been penetrated or if there's been some type of breach or not. These are only companies that know that they've been breached. Now, in general, companies must be ready for large-scale attacks, both from external parties trying to get access to data. Now, in addition, did you know that over 70% of financial losses are actually due to fraud that come from inside the internal parties themselves? Now, not just external hackers. So we're also seeing a marked increase in companies starting to protect themselves from the inside as well, and not just securing themselves from the external hackers. So how is the internal audit department impacted? Well, in so many ways. I'm sure I have no place telling you that you should focus on this now. Controls for access and security are of the utmost importance. Even the SEC and external auditors are significantly heightening their scrutiny on these controls, and it's going to increase in 2019. It's a continuing trend that's not going to change. Now, this means that you've got to keep your designs of your controls strong and make sure that they continue to operate effectively. Just sounds simple, right? Well, where I see gaps, though, in many of the companies that we work with, are ineffective annual risk reviews. So if this doesn't get a lot of attention now, it probably should increase it. And this is where new risks make themselves more evident, especially risks around external security and access controls. So often this is an overlooked activity to review and refresh your control catalogs. But just remember that this is an ever-changing field. Control catalogs must be updated quite often. Now, automation in all forms was a hot topic in 2018. In fact, I presented at a panel on this topic, and it continues to be so in 2019, especially as it relates to GRC and governance, risk, and compliance. Now, we have seen, and Gartner is also reporting, there's a much higher adoption of automated solutions for solving common risk and compliance tasks. So if you think about it, though, automation really does make a whole lot of sense. Now, generally speaking, people make mistakes. Sometime or another, somebody makes a mistake. Small, big, doesn't matter. They still make mistakes. So with the complexity of these controls, and especially the complexity of the financial systems that these controls are ensuring completeness and accuracy on, and the security structures and reporting relationships consistently increasing, the likelihood of these mistakes is increasing too. So what's worse is the impact of mistakes, regardless of if you think it's a big or a small one, the impact of it is so much higher today. And that's because both of the scale of the businesses that we're operating now, as well as even just the regulation, the increase in regulation and the fines and the implications of material deficiencies. Even this thing of personal director accountability is on the line here sometimes. So automation makes a whole lot of sense here. If you set it up correctly and it's complete and it's accurate and it's reliable, it doesn't make mistakes, and the likelihood of failure decreases substantially. So it's a win-win. But just a word of caution, though, and I've seen this, is setting up automated systems incorrectly repeats your mistakes. The only difference now is it repeats it at scale. And I've seen that happen too often. So this understanding that automation is needed, and the fact that automated systems are now cheaper to implement and to get up and running, there is a much higher increase in the expectation that companies adopt them. And that's where you see Gartner's reports coming out talking about in 2019, 2020, 2021, there's going to be almost a doubling of the number of companies that adopt automated systems to manage governance risk compliance tasks. And that's starting significantly to increase right now. But not only that, external auditors are now requiring some type of automated system in place, whereas before they were okay with manual type testing. These are some of the types of dashboards that are available out there with automation. It allows you to to look and track your risks over time. And there's some amazing GRC solutions out there that I can name. Obviously, we put our dashboard up there because we thought it would be really nice to look at. So I'm going to talk about another poll. And do you believe that automation software is an effective tool for governance risk and compliance? Right, I think we stopped there quickly because that's obviously everybody does. Okay, we're going to move on quickly.
All
So
right,
I'm
thanks,
going to hand
Jody.
over to Mike.
Yes.
Thanks, Mike.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you. Yes, thank you very much for handing over. So let's talk a little bit about the trend that we've seen of SAP customers moving to S4. Obviously, the trend is very much fueled by SAP's announcement to make the legacy ECC Business Suite end of life in less than 6 years. So there isn't a lot of time to lose. And just to give you some context and numbers, we have seen the number of S4 users increase dramatically by 41% actually between 2017 and 2018. And I can only expect that trend to continue given that we are working towards a deadline. I mean, it's still 6 years out, but if you know how long such projects take on average, there is not a lot of time to dilly-dally. So, and that's especially true because what many SAP customers underestimate is the impact of a migration on your security concept. And I think SAP might be a little bit to blame for that because at least historically they have kind of downplayed the impact on a migration, the effort on a migration. And what's important to understand for everyone is that moving to S4, or that S4 itself is a new product line and not just an upgrade. It's not like installing an enhancement pack or anything like that. It's a new product line. And SAP has made significant changes to the data model and architecture in S4 that we have not seen in ECC before. And for the most part, that's a good thing because one of SAP's goals was to remove redundancies and to only have one solution or one way of doing things for each requirement. And I'm not going to go into too many details here, but if you're interested in learning more about that, there is a simplification list out there. It's a document, 900 plus pages strong, that SAP has put out, where they describe all of those changes to the data model and to the architecture that you will have to take into account to potentially adjust your business processes if you move to S4, and all the changes that you will have to make to your roles and authorizations. But just to give you one example, the process of registering a vendor invoice. Today in ECC, you can either do that in the material management module or in the finance module. So there are two redundant and duplicate capabilities spread out across two modules to accomplish one simple task. In S4, SAP has consolidated that into what they call invoice management. And so the result of that is a massive reduction of applications and transactions that will directly impact your security. And that means your roles and authorizations, as well as your GRC rule set to a lesser extent, but still. And so the key takeaway from this slide really is that the move to S4 is not simply an upgrade. It's a project that will contain or entail a role remediation or security redesign, hopefully at the beginning of that project. And so our recommendation is to start considering your move to S4 hopefully this year, or at least relatively early, so you have plenty of time to make those adjustments before the actual migration project kicks off. And so in particular, our recommendation would be to make sure your current SAP environment, the one that you want to migrate to S4, is clean and risk-free, at least as clean and risk-free as possible from a security perspective. That means take a very close look at your current roles and authorizations and redesign them, clean them up, remove SOD conflicts. Whenever you build or design new roles, make sure you leverage best practices. And again, without going into too many details here, but follow the SAP security guidelines, consider the use of single roles, make use of SAP's authorizations proposals database, which is SU24, etc. Use those technicalities to build roles based on standards and based on best practices, because we've seen it so much easier to lift and shift a security concept that's based on best practice versus having a messy concept that requires a lot of cleaning up during the project. And we have seen so many customers that realized the impact on the security only when they got to acceptance testing, when they figured out, hey, we have to make changes to our roles, authorizations, GRC rules, etc. And obviously at that point in the project, it's relatively late. And if your roles are not up to par at that point, then you may delay in the best case scenario or completely derail an S4 migration project. And that's obviously neither in your interest as a customer, nor in the interest of SAP. And so what's important is to get the security team involved early on into a migration project, and to make sure your project leadership and your executive leadership both understand and are aware that moving to S4 impacts your overall security concept and potentially also business processes. And so get the security team involved early on, make sure everyone understands what needs to be done on the security before you can execute the rest of that project. And so here is a classic example. Jody mentioned it already. The use of automation tools can come in really handy, both from a role design, from a role testing, and then from an actual migration perspective. So there are tools out there, check them out and make sure you use them to your advantage to speed up your project and to reduce the risk of something going wrong. And with that, we're gonna go into another polling question. So what I'd like to know from you is your organization actively considering or planning a move to S/4HANA? So is this something maybe for this year? Is this on your wish list, something that you think about, something that's on the horizon, or maybe not at all? Or maybe you say, you know what, we don't even have SAP and I'm not sure what I'm doing on this webinar. But whatever the case is, give us your feedback, please, so we can see where you stand. Okay, this is a good split between project for this year and on the horizon, and for only very few it's not applicable and not on the horizon at all. So I assume it will be on the horizon sometime between now and 2025. All right, next topic, we're gonna move into vulnerabilities, specifically around communications interfaces. Now, I understand this is a very technical topic, so I'll try to make it as high level as possible. And just to set the stage and to make sure we're all on the same page, let's define what I mean by RFC interfaces. So, obviously within SAP, there are various communications interfaces that allow data to be exchanged either between two SAP systems or between an SAP and a non-SAP system. And RFC in particular stands for remote function call. So that allows, as the name implies, to execute a remote function or a function in a remote system. So imagine, for instance, you have an SAP system and you have a bank and you want to do payroll. And so your SAP system may communicate with the bank via an RFC interface to run that payroll. And because of that, RFC interfaces are often very business critical, and they have to work and they cannot stop functioning, because that would or could significantly disrupt business operations. And so that's one of the reasons why many customers give those RFC interfaces and the associated technical users a lot of authorizations. They over authorize those interfaces just to make sure that they don't stop working. But with that comes a potential vulnerability. If someone gains unauthorized access, either from an internal threat or someone external gains access to those interfaces that are over authorized, that person may gain unvetted access to potentially sensitive information that could be GDPR relevant, for example. And one of the reasons why customers over authorize such interfaces is because it's incredibly difficult and complex to properly authorize those technical users and interfaces using a least privilege principle, meaning giving them only what they absolutely need, but not more. And there is an OSS note out there that explains kind of on a high level what you need to do to correctly authorize those interfaces. You can look that up if you like. But there are a couple of steps that you can take, and unfortunately those steps are relatively involved, but they are important. And so we've seen a trend starting early last year and then continuing into this year, where companies say, you know what, let's take a closer look at those communication interfaces in our landscape and make sure we have them properly authorized, so that we reduce the risk, we reduce liability, and we prevent someone from gaining access to all of our data in SAP. And just to throw out one piece of technical information here, there is an authorization profile called SAP-all, and as the name already implies, that gives you very widespread access within SAP, and that's a very common authorization profile that we see over and over again our customers use for such RFC interfaces. And so taking that away and only providing the access the interface really needs, as I've mentioned, is incredibly complex. But there are 4 steps that you can take to harden those interfaces, to reduce the risk and your potential liability, especially in light of GDPR and other compliance regulations. Just imagine someone gaining access to one of those interfaces with admin access. That person could see all of the GDPR relevant data, any personal identifiable information, whatever sensitive stuff you have stored inside of SAP is potentially at risk. So what do you need to do? Well, the first step you need to do is you need to understand what the interface is doing, and there are several sources of information within SAP that you can tap to find out which of those remote functions and function modules the interface is calling. What is the interface really doing, so I can build proper authorizations for it. The next step might be to scan your custom code. Very often, interfaces work with custom applications that you developed in-house or that someone developed for you. And so you need to scan that code and understand what it is doing. What is the interface doing with that code? Is it pulling data maybe from a specific table? Whatever the case might be, you need to understand what's inside that code. And there are several types of code scanners available that you can use to gain insight into exactly that. And then, based on that understanding of what the interface needs and what it's doing, you need to build roles using, again, best practices like we've discussed before. Without, again, going into too many details, building roles via the menu, leveraging SU24, etc. Build roles that contain all the required authorizations so you can then start testing them. And this is really the most critical part, and that's where many projects, many RFC optimization projects fail and get derailed, because testing is incredibly difficult, especially because your interface to the bank, you may only have in your production landscape. You might not have an interface to your bank that you can easily test in a non-production environment. So how do you properly test it? Well, again, that's where test automation and simulation tools can come in handy, such as the ones mentioned in the OSS note, because without, it's incredibly difficult to find the gaps and to build roles that really have everything the interface needs. Because if there is something missing and you go live with your new authorization concept, and then the interface breaks down in the middle of the night because it cannot make a certain remote function call, then someone is gonna get slapped, most likely. And so with that said, we're gonna open it up to questions. And so I'd like to hear, what you guys need to know based on what we've told you. And so let's open it up.
Great. So there's a section in the webinar that you can go and you can type questions in. We've had a couple come through already. One is, we have an IDM solution. Do we need SOD access controls? I guess I'll answer that. But while I'm answering, if anyone else has more questions, please feel free to type in. Yes. So one of the things about identity and access management is that it would assign roles to your users and or take it away based upon built-in workflows. The challenge, though, is are you introducing more risk into your environment through these activities? Role owners typically don't know the answer to that. Users typically don't know the answer to that. So by integrating it into your identity and access management solution, you'd be able to predict it before it actually occurs and escalate accordingly. We have another one come through. How do you recommend use of GRC to provide the automation that you mentioned? Okay. So it depends on what part of governance risk compliance you're asking about. I mean, GRC is as big as if you say I work in IT, essentially. So the GRC areas that we work in are around access controls, controls around access to your systems. So I'll answer in light of that. So you would automate things like segregation duties, the provisioning of your users. You would introduce workflows which allow you to request access according to well thought out workflows, predict the impact to your environment so that you can stop risks from occurring during the provisioning process. You can detect users that are dormant within this right amount of time frames so that your ITGC controls are effective, etc. So you would implement an automated access control solution like what we're providing or what Xiting is providing to allow you to automate your controls. GRC is a very large area, so there are many other solutions in this space that can automate almost every type of governance, risk, or compliance activity. You give me an activity, I'll tell you what solution would be best for you to use. I hope that answered your question. We have another one here. Can you tell us where to find the 900-page SAP S4 document referenced in the webinar? I think that's you, Mike.
Yes, I'm going to just paste in the link here as an answer. That's for, obviously it depends on the version of S4 you want to migrate to, but for the 1709, there is no 1809. I have the link here handy and I can look up the link for 1809 if applicable, but I'm going to reply here just with the link. So that's one of those simplification lists.
Great. So we don't have any other questions that have come through. I think we'll just wait another minute. And while we're waiting, thank you so much for your time, everybody. If you would like to find out more information about myself and or Mike, our contact information is above there. Please take a visit to our websites. We absolutely love solving these problems, and we'd love to help you if you have any need for assistance. With that being said, I think, did another one come through? Yes. It's just a thank you. Okay, so with that being said, I'm going to close this webinar down. Thank you very much for your time today. We will be recording this and will be on both of Xiting and European Maestro's websites for later listening if you'd like to share it with anybody. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.